Welcome to the Commonwealth Policy Center's legislative briefing. This week's topic is critical race theory. And joining us is Jonathan Butcher of the Heritage Foundation. And Jonathan, it's a real privilege to have you here and to share with us and legislators concerned about this issue, how to understand this, some of the basics, and then maybe think through this as three different bills are being considered in the Kentucky legislature right now. So Jonathan Butcher, the floor is yours. Love to hear your perspective, and then maybe you can do some Q&A for us as well.
Well, thank you and good evening, and it's a pleasure to be with you. A lot of people have asked, what is critical race theory? And the simplest way to describe it is that it is a worldview that views everything in public and private life in terms of racial identities. Everything that happens around us is caused by racial discord or the relationships between people from different backgrounds. There are a couple of core components of critical race theory that must be understood to recognize the threat that this poses both to the culture that everyone lives in each day, as well as the policy and social structures that we all participate in, whether it's government, schools, churches, or any community activities that people are a part of. So the first is that critical race theory believes that racial discrimination is appropriate. So they believe that it is necessary to be racially prejudiced against other people, that is a part of the core idea around which they can then make up for or account for whatever happened in America's past. So because America did have an element of systemic racism in slavery, which was abhorrent and terrible, that we must be racially discriminatory against white individuals today in order to account for what happened before. There are those who were critical race theory scholars like Derek Bell and Richard Delgado, who argue an idea called interest convergence, which says that the only reason civil rights made progress in the United States is because white individuals were trying to preserve their power. So they only allowed the Civil Rights Bill to pass and the civil rights movement to unfold because white individuals were trying to hold their power. And this plays out today in groups such as the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice, when they create K-12 materials that say that white individuals have not just privilege, but are oppressors because of the color of their skin. And they actually have lesson plans that teach this and that say that certain individuals, not because of their behavior, but because of their ethnicity, are a threat to others. This, of course, violates some of the core ideas, not just behind the civil rights movement, but behind America's founding concepts of freedom and opportunity and equality under the law. The second idea that many people hear a lot about today is this constant perpetuation of victimhood, right? Everyone is a victim, or at least those who are of minority ethnicities are victims. And this comes from a lot of different components within critical race theory, one of which is called intersectionality. Intersectionality is a core idea in critical race theory developed by a professor named Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. And her argument is that individuals who are not white nor male have a set of identities which, when layered on top of each other, create a multi-layered oppression, an intersection, if you will, of oppressed identities. And the application of this, when we see it in schools, are lessons that argue that America is systemically racist, that America cannot be cured of its racism. And so the American dream doesn't belong to all of us. It doesn't belong to certain children because of their racial background. They will always be oppressed, which, by the way, is the subtitle of known as the godfather of critical race theory, Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. He said the persistence of racism. I think the third idea that's most important is that critical race theory is meant to be applied. It is at once a worldview as well as a verb. And those that developed the idea of critical race theory said as much. They said so they being Delgado and Stefancic in their book, An Introduction to Critical Race Theory, that the theory has an applied dimension. It is meant to be put into practice so that American life is disrupted. The reason that we can get to this place and say that critical race theory intends to disrupt the structures that I've been describing, from schools to government to culture, is because the theory is really based on critical legal theory, which was developed particularly in the 1970s, and argued that law is not neutral, that American law in particular was developed by people who had biases, and those biases can never be erased. And so American law will always be oppressive to certain people. Critical legal theory was based on top of critical theory, which was an argument from a group of Marxists in the 1920s who argued that traditional Enlightenment values and using reason and science to understand the world around us were not enough. And they tried to reboot Marxism and combine it with some complicated ideas that have to do with Freud and postmodernism, and marry these two concepts, that we will always have class oppression, there will always be class conflict, and that there is no historical or moral foundation on which we could build a society that would allow for the peaceful coexistence of people from different ethnicities, okay? So as you follow this line of thinking to critical race theory, you see that they are trying to apply this Marxist thought that they want to disrupt the culture and the institutions around us that we depend on every day. So with that, what do we do about it? You see this in schools today, first with lessons about white privilege. There's a website at the Iowa City School District website that has a whole lesson plan on white privilege. There's a school district out in California called, right across the bay from San Francisco, called Hayward Unified School District, that says that they intend to keep critical race theory in the classroom. The Portland Public School System has a set of videos online by a critical race theory working group who are teachers from the district. So these arguments that critical race theory is not found in classrooms is patently false. And I am happy to provide you any number of examples where the words critical race theory are used in different classrooms around the US. So what do we do, right? And how should we address this, both as policymakers as well as taxpayers? So first, no individual should be compelled to affirm, profess, believe any idea that violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is part of the language that was just adopted in Mississippi and approved by the governor just a couple of days ago. This language is under consideration in different states around the country, including Arizona, as well as South Carolina, as well as Georgia has similar language as well. So the reason that this is the appropriate way to structure the language is because critical race theory has an applied dimension. They are not just teaching students history from a racial perspective. They are asking students to live it out or to affirm it. And they do that in privilege walks. They do that in mandatory affinity groups. They do that through diversity trainings for public school teachers. They do that through assignments where students are asked to defend the idea that America is systemically racist. So students are being asked not just to repeat to educators what critical race theory is, they are being asked to apply it to their lives. So by saying that no public official may compel a teacher or student to affirm something that violates the Civil Rights Act, you are saying that the application of critical race theory, which results in racial prejudice, is illegal. So the application of the idea is illegal. And that protects the discussion of ideas in the classroom. That allows conservatives or anyone to avoid the accusation or to rebut the accusation that you're just trying to ban books, or that you're just trying to silence the discussion of slavery or the Jim Crow era, right? The idea is not to ban ideas that our students really should be wrestling with, but it is to say that no one should be required to act on accusations or claims of racial prejudice. Secondly, and this is also important, that there are proposals today in Arizona as well as in Kansas, as well as in Wisconsin, considered recently by lawmakers in Pennsylvania, that says that parents should be able to see and access what students are being taught in the classroom. Parents should be made active participants in seeing what their children are being taught. And you can do this with language that says that a list of books, a syllabus, a set of materials, even homework assignments should be made available online so that parents can see it. Obviously, this can be done because teachers do it all the time and did so during the pandemic when everyone had to be taught online when schools were closed to in-person learning. So claims that this can't be done or is too burdensome for teachers are also patently false. Third, and I think that this final proposal is one that can encompass everything that I've discussed so far, as well as adding a couple of other ideas, is the consideration of a parent bill of rights. A parent bill of rights is a proposal that affirms that parents are a child's primary caregiver. You can include the ideas that prohibit compelled speech. You can also include what I just described about academic transparency, while also reaffirming that schools must receive permission from parents to administer health or medical services to students. And this is essential today because there is a strong movement happening across the country where educators are saying that they do not have to report to parents when a child determines that they want to change their gender and go by a different pronoun in a school. And there are, in fact, I was just reading today about policies in Kansas. Topeka, for example, has a policy that says that school officials should not, they're actually prohibited from informing parents when a child, a minor, by the way, in a K-12 school, says that they want to change their gender identity and be addressed as a different gender in a school. So protections that say that parents must be informed about any, not just informed about any health or medical service such as counseling that a child's going to receive, but they should have the final say about whether anything is actually conducted on a child, whether that's cough syrup or Tylenol, or whether that's some sort of intensive therapy regarding a child's questions about their gender. Parents must be put back in the center, which is why it is called a Parent Bill of Rights. Some of you watching this may know that Florida lawmakers just approved language very similar to what I just described. Lawmakers in more than a dozen states, from Kansas to the other states that are considering would be sorry, it's just escaped me the list that I had in my mind. Oh, Indiana. So Indiana has actually produced a guidebook that is excellent, outlining the important issues that should be covered in a Parent Bill of Rights. And you have Hawaii is considering one, but I'm happy to provide a longer list of those states. But it's this, I believe, is a vehicle that can put together all of these different things that I've described to you here. So very quickly about the proposals that I reviewed prior to this discussion today, I think that some of what is described in these ideas of what encompasses divisive concepts or divisive topics does cover a lot of important issues to be dealt with by lawmakers as they protect individuals from discrimination. I would argue, though, that the way to apply this through a policy is to say that no individual should be compelled to affirm any of the divisive concepts that are listed earlier in some of these proposals. I also think that it's essential to make sure that the State Board of Education or the State Department of Education is a willing partner in any proposals to change what is taught or require the discussion of, say, America's founding documents. The reason is because while lawmakers may be able to put this in a policy, to actually have it implemented and carried out is going to require the actions of individuals from these state agencies. So I think while you can require it from the legislative level, the actual implementation is going to be quite difficult and could be something where teachers can easily say that they're being restricted from saying certain things, or that the requirements to teach certain documents conflict with what they are hearing from their district or from their principal. So again, I think the intent is very strong. However, I would argue that when it comes to state standards in particular and the requirements about what is taught, that it is best done through the State Board of Education, who can then implement it through both its relationship to the agency as well as school districts. I would argue too that the issues that I've just discussed here and prohibiting compelled speech are important at the K-12 level. They do not function as well at the higher education level because the rules about free speech on college campuses are different from the rules about free speech in K-12. And it's actually true that recent cases at the Supreme Court level and elsewhere have said that public school teachers, public employees really can have their free speech rights curtailed or amended when they're in the course of their public duties, whereas it's different at the higher education level. And I would argue too that if we restrict what is discussed or talked about in higher education, we are now coming into conflict with what I feel is important, which is the Chicago Statement on Free Speech from the University of Chicago, which conservatives have rallied around for many years in an effort to protect free speech on campus. This statement says that it is not a school's job to protect individuals from ideas with which they disagree. And so if we believe that as conservatives, it's important for us to allow for the discussion of difficult topics in higher education as well as K-12, but especially in higher ed. I think the same application would apply, though, when it comes to protecting free speech, that I think that the language has to be different than what goes into K-12. I have model language on free speech on campus, and I'm happy to provide anyone who's interested, that I think would help to get us to this point that would solve what lawmakers are trying to resolve here. I think, having said that, you can, though, say that through diversity trainings, that those should not be required for public college officials, and that public college officials should not be required to have any sort of professional development that compels them to affirm any of the divisive topics or frankly, prejudicial ideas that come through critical race theory. Finally, let me mention, since I talked a little bit about gender identity, let me just close with this final thought. When we discuss this issue of how to address biological sex and gender identity through legislation or through a parent bill of rights, it is will work against, I believe, the conservative efforts in the future if you list sex as an immutable characteristic along the lines of race and ethnicity and country of origin, because radical activists want to add sex to other titles within the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 in Titles 4 and 6 pertain to education and don't list sex, biological sex, as an immutable characteristic. Those who would like to essentially force schools to allow students to claim to transition or claim to change their gender identity want sex added. So a better way to deal with this is through the medical decision-making that I listed in my description of a parent bill of rights, that kind of language that empowers parents to have the ability to opt in and not just opt out, to always be the final say when it comes to medical decisions. That's the best way to protect students when it comes to those issues. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or talk more about everything that I've listed here.
No, Jonathan, thank you so much. I appreciate your perspective. You're a wealth of knowledge, balanced perspective on this very controversial and difficult topic. I want to go back to something you touched on, but I would like to hear you say it again. One of the strong arguments I've heard from the education community is that if any one of the bills proposed in the Kentucky legislature were forwarded, there's two in the House in particular that are more conservative. The one in the Senate, Senate Bill 138, is considered a little more broad-based. But if any, particularly the House bills were to pass, it would restrict teachers' freedom of speech in the classroom. Now, you did address this, but I want you in a couple of different points, but speak to that again if you could.
So I think
speech in the class, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think that any proposal that tries to apply a prohibition on talking about divisive topics in higher education in particular may not stand in court. I think that there are legal challenges that could be made that simply wouldn't stand given the existing laws about higher education. When it comes to K-12, it is important that we don't try to limit what teachers talk about in the classroom, say banning the 1619 project, for example, which I have written in opposition to. I have pointed out the errors in the project. I have argued that the project is a revisionist history that is trying to reshape the way that we understand America's founding ideals. It itself rejects the idea that America is a land of opportunity. I mean, point blank. But all that being said, I do think that teachers and educators should not be afraid to utter those words, 1619, or talk about what's in it. I think instead that students should not be required to affirm that the 1619 project is the only way to understand American history, or that the 1619 project can be defended in a research paper. I think it is the responsibility of both parents and principals and curriculum coordinators to have the elements of America's founding documents, of arguments that would oppose what's in the 1619 project and others, so that students have an alternate opinion on which they can build their structure, build their understanding of American history. And I don't think it's as difficult as this sounds. I mean, yes, you're going to have teachers who believe the 1619 project is the best way to understand history. The ultimate solution there is for parents to say, this is not the school for my child and I need to move them somewhere else. And so that's why what Kentucky has done in recent years regarding education savings accounts and tax credit scholarships is so essential, why those programs must be protected. They must be expanded to include as many students as possible for this very reason, right? We can do things through policy to promote the teaching of quality content, but ultimately we don't have a way without, I think, betraying the ultimate purpose of education, which is the pursuit of truth, by banning ideas from the classroom. I think we can protect against compelled speech and the application of racial ideas.
Very good, Jonathan, appreciate that. How would you respond to proponents of CRT who might say, if there's a person in the majority community, let's say in this country it's white, teaching a history class, that history cannot be treated favorably because of their skin color? How do you respond to that?
I mean, that's a racially discriminatory idea that an individual, just based on the color of their skin, couldn't teach a subject. I think that we should be telling students that the institutions of slavery, of Jim Crow, were a betrayal of America's founding ideals. They were a betrayal of what this nation is based on, and that the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement effectively made racism and discrimination illegal first, and then culturally abhorrent, right? That doesn't mean that racist acts are not going to happen. Of course they are. That's a part of fallen humanity, and that's why we need proposals that say that it is illegal to call someone an oppressor or a victim just based on their ethnicity. Remember, one of the leading spokespeople for critical race theory today is Ibram X. Kendi, the professor up in Boston. And in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says that racial discrimination is necessary in the present to make up for past discrimination. Future discrimination will also be necessary. Also, as an aside, he claims that capitalism and racism are conjoined twins, which takes us back, right, to the critical theory Marxist roots of critical race theory. One of the quotes that I use all the time is a law professor in California named Angela Harris said that she called Marx's analysis of capitalism dazzling, and that it is still riveting to contemporary theorists. She wrote that in an essay only about 15 years ago. So Marxism is still at the heart of, and class conflict, of what critical race theory is trying to use to destabilize American culture.
Jonathan, could you tell us how many states have passed legislation that would prohibit the teaching of CRT in K through 12 public schools in the country? Any idea how many states might have done that?
So in one way or another, about, I would say, it depends on how you frame the legislation. I mean, I think that there have been 24 states at least that have either considered or passed some proposal that tries to limit the use of critical race theory in the classroom. I'll note a couple for you because these are important. One is New Hampshire. New Hampshire uses the compelled speech language that I described for you earlier. And this bill is important because the American Federation for Teachers, the teachers union, sued this law. And they are arguing that it is violates, the state constitution. And so I think watching this lawsuit will be important because you can, as lawmakers will know, you can put a severability clause into a piece of legislation like this to protect the language that a court would deem lawful or constitutional, whereas striking things that they deem are not. And I would say, given the long history from the US Supreme Court and elsewhere, saying that compelled speech is not a protected act, right, that prohibition on compelled speech would stand. So New Hampshire, Idaho has passed similar language. Mississippi, I named earlier. There are an assortment of others. Oklahoma is one. Texas is another that passed variations of this. But I think that given what we've learned over the past 18 months, I expect that lawmakers in both of those states will go back to make their language stronger, given what we know about how critical race theory is actually applied in classrooms.
Very good. Jonathan, as the Kentucky legislature winds down, do you have any words of wisdom or words of advice for Kentucky legislators as they address the issue of critical race theory?
Well, first, recognize that it's not just an idea that we're fighting. We are trying to protect individuals and children from racial prejudice. We're trying to protect, no matter the color of your skin or your background, from racial bias. And that's what critical race theory brings. It is inseparable from critical race theory. Second, I think that any proposals that are considered must be able to stand in court. I think that if we propose something, or if a lawmaker proposes something dealing with critical race theory or SOGI issues in the classroom, and the language is not airtight and it is struck down, that, as many will know, sets back the movement, right, to ultimately protect individuals from discrimination. So I think being very careful about how this language is crafted, making sure that it is supported, if possible, by Supreme Court precedents, which is why the compelled speech language is one that I've mentioned so often, as well as language that is easily applied, such as the academic transparency and the Parent Bill of Rights. These are all things that have been tested in other places, and I believe are effective solutions as we try to protect children really from radical ideas, either related to gender or racial prejudice.
Very good. Jonathan Butcher, do you have any final comments? Any other thoughts related to this? This has been great, by the way. I know this is going to be helpful to our Kentucky legislature as they tune in.
Well, I hope so. And you know how to reach me, and I'd be happy to work with lawmakers to help them really protect all parents and families in Kentucky from really what is an effort to remove the foundations from the land of freedom and opportunity in which we all treasure. Jonathan,
let me give you a quick plug for your book. You did write a book recently. It's called Splintered: Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth. This was from Bombardier Books, issued or released in February 2022, so just last month. How can people get a hold if they want to order that book? Is it on Amazon?
Thank you. It is available for purchase on Amazon. The physical copies will be available in April, something about a paper shortage, but the copies are actually at the printer right now being printed. And I'll be hosting an event releasing this book on March 31st at the Heritage Foundation that people will be able to watch online. So we're very excited about that.
Love to participate. Love to get a signed copy from you
It'd be my pleasure. I'd be happy to.
All right. Jonathan Butcher of the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for joining us. God bless you and keep up the good work.